Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's webcast, we're talking about optimizing resource management for project success in today's hybrid world. We'll take a look at resourcing best practices with the goal of boosting project quality and creating a sustainable, balanced work environment. To discuss that, I'm joined by Jacob Cancellaire, Senior Vice President, Account Enablement at Rego Consulting. Jacob, good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Also with me is Pete Hughes, Vice President of Business Development at Rego Consulting. Pete, good to have you on the panel.
Thanks, James. Good to be here.
All right, so before we begin, Jacob, can you tell us a bit about Rego Consulting? How does the company serve its clients?
Yeah, certainly. So Rego Consulting is just over 250 people now, and Rego Consulting's focus is project management, project portfolio management, and resource management excellence. So we help our clients mature their practices. We do that in sort of two distinct ways. One is technology. So we help implement software systems and tools to be able to do these things. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. And then we also teach methodologies and provide training, whether you're agile or waterfall or strategic portfolio management. We have all of those sort of practitioner experts available to you, folks just like you who've run project management groups. And we're here to help.
Sounds good. All right. So before we get started, I have just a bit of housekeeping to do. First of all, thank you everyone for attending today. We really appreciate it. We do want to hear from you, and we'll be answering your questions at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to send questions along using the Q&A section on your screen. You don't need to wait until the end. You can enter questions anytime during the presentation. Also, today's webinar is being recorded. We'll send you the recording in the next 24 hours. All right, Jacob, Pete, whenever you're ready, please go ahead and get started.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. So firstly, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today to discuss, a topic that is fairly fundamental nowadays to the success of any organization. So as James mentioned, my name's Pete Hughes. I've been working in the SPM and PPM space for the last 20 years. I am very happy to be joined by my colleague and good friend, Jacob Cancellaire, another veteran in the PPM space. I'm going to say good morning again. Hi, Jacob.
Hello, Peter. Thank you.
So we've got a lot to cover in the next sort of 45 minutes to 60 minutes. As James mentioned, we've got a polling opportunity, so we would really love you to participate in that. We've also got the Q&A portal as well. We will try and respond to questions throughout the session, but obviously if we don't get through those questions, we will address them at the end. So Jacob, I don't know about you, but this topic comes up over and over and over again. I know it's cliche to mention this, but organizations are always trying to do more with less. So I don't see demand slowing down at all. Everybody's trying to out-innovate everybody else. Everybody's increasing value to the customer, but almost in the same breath. Everybody's reducing headcount, they're reducing costs, they're cutting budgets. So I don't know about you, but I see this question come up over and over again. How do I get more value or productivity out of the resources that I've got available? You seeing the same thing?
Same thing here. Market conditions change over the years, but this is my 21st year in helping implement resource management systems. And, it's a lot of the same fundamentals, but we are dealing with unique situations. During our massive economic disruption with COVID, I didn't know which way organizations would go on project management and resource management, and we found our business grew. We supported clients to decide, how do we deploy resources to the most important work? And so resource management practices and project management practices became critical to surviving that time, that really difficult economy. And so same fundamentals as I've seen for these 21 years, but a lot of really new methodologies and approaches and disruptions that are impacting it. So we're going to cover a lot of those today.
Absolutely. Yeah. And do you know what else I see? Not only value in improving resource management and capacity planning processes, but I also see organizations that are challenged in saying no. I can't do more work. I am already at capacity, but then justifying why they're saying no. I don't know if you're seeing the same thing.
Yep. Organizations that are going through rapid growth typically don't say no. Organizations that are reasonably healthy, maybe not rapid growth, they struggle with it. And then organizations that are having a downturn, they have no choice to learn how to say it really quick. And so how do we build up those habits and skill sets while things are going well to understand where our capacity threshold is? It's always exciting to be in a growing company and for everyone to jump in and help and work really hard, but it's not sustainable if you're not like at a baseline. And in our presentations here, we're going to talk about the importance of level capacity planning and giving people, a reasonable workload so they can have, a reasonable work day and less stress and less context switching. So we're going to dig right into that.
No, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, and the nice thing is, we've seen firsthand how effective resource management and capacity planning can transform an organization, but not just the way that they run projects, but also, as you mentioned, the overall morale of the team and the efficiency of that team. So by making... Yeah, go on.
Our organization's a good example. We've grown 15 to 20 people every year since I've been here for 7 years now. And we really practice a lot of resource management good habits. And we'll share some of those today, but we spend the time and we make sure we assign the right people and personalities to the right client with the right skill set. It's very important to our success as a consulting firm.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I don't think, making a start with resource management and capacity planning doesn't necessarily need to be difficult. By making tiny little shifts from reactive to proactive approaches, you prevent a lot of the firefighting. You know what it's like when you go into these organizations that have zero when it comes to resource management and capacity planning. They're constantly firefighting. You've got last-minute scrambles. Teams are burnt out. Projects derailed. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through how we can overcome some of those challenges. And we're going to look at how we build smarter, more sustainable resource management processes. So we'll look at the fundamental parts of resource management as we go through the presentation, resource management capacity planning, and along with some of the best practices that we've gained over the years of battle scars. And I'm sure if you ask Jacob nicely, he might show you some of those scars. Brilliant. Fine. So let's start off with the fundamentals. So ground zero. So what does resource management and capacity planning really mean? And why is it essential? Why is it an essential process for any organization? So I like this explanation. This is a ChatGPT explanation. Can you believe that? So this is a really, really good explanation of what resource management and capacity planning actually is. And I'm just going to read it verbatim. So resource management and capacity planning is the process of ensuring that any organization has the necessary resources available and optimally allocated to meet current and future project demands efficiently. So it's a great explanation of, at a high level, what resource management and capacity planning actually is. But basically, at its core, it's all about making sure that your organization has the right resources. Now, whether that's people, tools, budget, money, equipment, whatever it might be, available and properly allocated to meet project demands both now and in the future. Just to manage expectations for this presentation, we're going to be focusing more on the human side of resource management, but it is an important point to pull out that both equipment, budget, money would also fall under the category of resource management.
Right on. And it's funny, I was in manufacturing engineering, which was really a lot more about tools and flow and parts and nuts and bolts and things. And then I was hired to implement a resource management system. And I used all those same sort of approaches and methodologies for efficiencies, but then quickly learned how to adapt them to people. So, but yeah, today we're talking about people.
But the same principle applies. If you've got a crane, it's a bit like having a resource with a very niche skill. Same principle applies. And if we continue along that, guys, so continue to look at some of the fundamentals of capacity planning and resource management, let's just clarify these two terms because they're often used interchangeably. And I can almost guarantee that I will be using these interchangeably as we go through this presentation. But first off, capacity planning. So this is really about the big picture. So it's essentially the process of determining if an organization has the resources to meet current and future project demand, taking into account your pipeline projects. So it's really a long-term view of what's happening with your resources. But then on the other hand, we've got resource management, and this is kind of more of an operational process rather than a long-term planning process. So, once your capacity is planned, the resource management project takes over, and it's really a case of making sure you're finding the right person with the right skills at the right time to satisfy your project demand. So the key difference here, and it's worth pulling this out early in the presentations, the key difference here is really capacity planning is about forecasting and preparing, whereas resource management is more that operational process, execution, your day-to-day allocation. So what's the purpose of resource management and capacity planning and resource management as it's this way around on the slide? So, now that we've defined what capacity planning and resource management is, let's talk about why they're important for your organization. So first and foremost, I'm speaking now as a resource manager, we are a value driver. We contribute to the delivery of value within your organization. So just by going through the process, just by ensuring that resources are efficiently allocated and optimized, capacity planning and resource management helps deliver value to your organization through completed projects. So there's obviously a dependency there, and we'll come on to that in a second. But by delivering projects successfully within your organization, we are actually facilitating the delivery of value. So next, and I've just mentioned this word, but next, you're also a facilitator. So some of the processes that we manage actually facilitate other processes. So they help with decision-making. And this includes things like prioritization, project planning, even to a degree feeding up into HR around hiring processes. So by having clear visibility into your current and future resource needs, you can actually make decisions about where to allocate resources and, in fact, when it's the right time to bring in more talent. And lastly, let's not forget about productivity, because it's a key part of resource management and capacity planning. So proper resource management actually increases productivity, but also stops the team from being burnt out and overworked. So when resources are well managed, teams work at their best without the stress of being overstretched. So it's important really to think of resource management and capacity planning as a function, both from an organizational perspective, where we're a value driver, where we're driving value for our organization, but also from a team perspective, where we're, essentially not overstretching a team, over allocating a team onto work. So what are the key components? So I kind of alluded to one of these a second ago, but we'll take a look at the key components that make up effective capacity planning and resource management. So these three elements, the project management, capacity and resource management, demand management, are all essential for building a comprehensive process for managing resources. So if you think first off, project management, so essentially that provides our framework for executing projects. So it ensures objectives, timelines, deliverables. I mean, we all are probably more than familiar with project management processes and frameworks. But from a resource management perspective, it actually helps us understand what resources are needed, which then actually facilitates the smooth delivery of that project. So on the right-hand side, we've got demand management. And so this is really about understanding what our future project looks like. What's demand coming from future project? So it helps us ensure that we're accurately identifying potential resource gaps and preparing for that upcoming demand. So demand management helps us bridge that gap between the resources that we have currently and the future demand of our organization. So it helps us to proactively manage rather than reactively manage. And then lastly, slap bang in the middle, we've got capacity planning and resource management. So this is obviously at the core of what we're going to be discussing today, but essentially it's assuring that an organization has the right resources available to deliver what they've promised. But it's important to note that all three of these processes They need to work in tandem to create a balanced and efficient process. If you're missing one, then you're going to have problems. And again, we'll come on to these in a second. So we're on for a poll. So, strongly encourage you guys to get involved in this. So how mature is resource management and capacity planning in your organization? Where are you on the journey? So are you guys very mature? Do you have sort of a fully optimized, data-driven, aligned with strategic goals? Or are you more towards the other end of the spectrum where it's sort of largely ad hoc with no real processes in place? Where would you put us?
So the poll should pop up for you. Make sure you scroll to the bottom and hit submit after you make your selection.
Oh, man, I can't see that on my screen. Where would you put Rego, Jacob?
Yeah, I would say we are. We would say we're BAB. When you're a services organization, you're less aligned to strategy and more aligned to, is each project staffed for success?
Yeah.
So other organizations that have larger resource pools that are trying to determine, are they working on the most valuable work? We want to make all our clients equally as happy. So it's a little bit different. So I think B is where you want to land as a service organization. But I see some results coming in here, and some folks are hovering in the C space, half the submissions. So processors are in place, but improvements needed. That's good. I mean, let's talk a little Tetris with them now, Peter, and maybe we find organizations that are in that maturity level of C or D. We end up working with them because they're kind of ready for a technology. Mm-hmm. They're starting to be of a size or complexity where Excel maybe isn't showing them what they need. And so that's where some automation can come into place. But we're going to tell you about the fundamentals outside the technology first.
Brilliant segue. Okay, so my mate Forrest Gump once said this. I'm pretty sure that this is a quote from the film. Life is like a box of chocolates, but capacity planning and resource management is like a game of Tetris. I'm pretty sure, I'm sure somebody in the chat would put me correct, but if it wasn't a quote from the film, it should have been a quote from the film, because when it comes to capacity planning and resource management, it is very much like a game of Tetris. So you're going to have to bear with me on this analogy, but it will make sense in a minute. So if you think about it, Tetris is, so each piece is different. So, and they keep coming at you one after another, and really your job to win the game of Tetris. And I'm kind of hoping that everybody on this call understands what Tetris is. But really your job to win that game is to try and fit all of the pieces together in the most efficient way possible. And if you don't plan ahead, and this is where that capacity planning piece comes in, if you don't plan ahead, essentially all of those pieces pile up very quickly, you lose control, and essentially you lose your game of Tetris. And if you think about it from a resource management perspective, it's almost exactly the same. I'd love it to be as simple as Tetris, because it does get quite complicated. But if you think about projects and demand, they keep coming in. Often left field, curveballs, just do it type project. And your goal as a resource manager or capacity planner is really to arrange your people in such a way that it fits everything, so nothing gets dropped. And you can keep that workflow moving efficiently. So in this scenario, there's going to be a couple of slides, so definitely bear with me with this Tetris analogy. But in this scenario, we're going to explore how we can play this game out using a team of 3 people. And we'll show you what happens when some of our enterprise processes are not necessarily working effectively. So this is our very, very simple planning scenario. So essentially we've got 3 projects with different demand for FTEs or full-time equivalent or people, basically. So if we walk through this situation, we're going to have to consider some of the areas that we need to look at in terms of managing. So just very quickly, just to explain the blocks. So one block is 1 week's demand for one person or one FTE. So we can have a look. Project 1 is a 2-week project that requires 2 people. Project 2, on the other hand, runs for a couple of weeks, but it ramps up in week number 2. And then finally, Project 3 is a bit longer at 3 weeks, but the 3rd week ramps up to 2 people. And as a resource manager, I'm going to ask myself a series of questions. Yeah, and these questions are actually the same over and over again. And there's a different variety to these questions, but essentially these are kind of the same 3 questions I ask myself. Is, can I take on additional workload? So if I look at the current resource allocation, where can we afford to add more projects without overstretching, overburdening the team? Can I balance the available resources to meet these demands? So if we see, ramping up projects and needs from these projects, how do we spread that team to ensure that each of these projects gets the right attention at the right time, gets the right resources at the right time? And then does anything need to change? So this is a bit of a catch-all, but, is there a smarter way to allocate these people? Should we consider shifting timelines? Should we be talking to HR about bringing more people in? So they're the 3 kind of questions I'm going to be asking myself over and over again. So let's jump into our scenarios. So scenario number 1. So in this scenario, we're going to be looking at what happens when there's no visibility. So I don't have any visibility of the pipeline in my organization. And without clear sight into what's coming down the line, our organization, or we end up being a little bit more of a reactive resource management organization. So we're essentially doing projects as soon as they come across the table. So as soon as I hear about something, I'm trying to resource it. Now, ironically, in this scenario, I'm actually delivering all 3 of my projects using the 3 people. But because I'm lacking that visibility, it leads to 2 major problems. In fact, 1 major problem, which is, waste, downtime, idle time, whatever you want to call it. So when we can see the full picture, we often end up when we can't see the full picture, we end up often misallocating resources. Teams might be overbooked, working beyond their capacity, while we've got other teams that are basically sitting idle, waiting for their next assignment. So not having visibility of the pipeline actually creates inefficiencies on both ends of the spectrum. So imagine this. I'm going to liken this now back to our Tetris analogy. So imagine trying to play Tetris without being able to see the next piece. I mean, it'd just be a nightmare. So you'd be sort of scrambling around, trying to get as many pieces in, you're unsure how things fit together. So the same thing happens with capacity planning. So without understanding the future resource needs, we end up either overwhelming teams, or teams end up sitting idle for long periods of time. What about if I don't have control of my capacity? So in this instance, it's probably even worse. At least in the first scenario, I was able to deliver all 3 of my projects. But in this scenario, we're actually focusing more on the consequence of not having visibility into our team's capacity. And when we don't have a clear picture of how much the team can handle, it becomes incredibly easy to lose control of that resource allocation. And this results in what is the worst thing for a team, which is essentially burnout. And of course, when you're asking a team to do a ton of work, it's very, very likely that they're going to be delayed, which leads to project delays, which leads to that ripple effect where it then affects resource management again. So essentially, without capacity visibility, if you haven't got control of the capacity of your team, you're going to be stacking project demands on top of each other. But the problem is we don't know where the gaps are, or if there's any room at all to do additional work. So work starts piling up almost in a completely disorganized way. Teams get overwhelmed, leading to, increased stress levels and eventually burnout and delayed projects. So when we lose sight of how much work our team can realistically handle, we stop planning effectively. And instead of balancing the workload, we just end up pushing everything forward, hoping our resources will magically fit everything into place. I don't know, Jake, if you see this in organizations, but we do see this quite a lot in the UK where, we're not doing resource management effectively and teams are being heavily overstretched.
Yep. It leads to a culture of heroics and burnout. Some organizations, they get by on this for a while, but it's not a long-term strategy. You know, it's should be in short sprints if you really need it, pushing for a big release or a busy time of the year in retail or whatever it may be, but it's not sustainable.
Yeah. I mean, even in this example, if you look at week number 2, I'm basically asking my 3-person team to do a workload of 6 people. Weekends, overtime, you might be able to do that for a day, but doing it weeks and weeks on end, unsustainable. So essentially, the key takeaway from this is it's simple. If you can't record and control your team's capacity, you can't manage it effectively. And that leads to missed deadlines, decreased productivity, and ultimately burnt out teams. So what does good look like? So I'm assuming those guys on this call that are good at Tetris have already probably worked this out. So when we successfully manage capacity and resources, we can achieve a balanced, optimized, and efficient workflow. So every piece in this scenario fits exactly where it needs to go. Nothing's out of place. So I'm able to deliver all 3 of these projects over a 4-week period without stretching the team. So if you go back to scenario number 1, I was able to deliver all of the projects, but essentially it was taking 7 weeks. In this instance, that's interesting. So in this instance, I'm able to deliver all 4 projects without overstretching the team. The projects are delivered on time, and I know that's quite heavily dependent on my project management processes, but the resources are used effectively, and most importantly, your team members are not being overstretched. And then, guess what happens? Real life.
More work.
So you know what it's like in real life. I wish it was as easy as a game of Tetris. But you're going to get, as soon as you balance your resources, you know what's going to happen. You're going to have demand coming left, right, and center from senior management, from people that just need something done, that little piece of work. So everything obviously must be completed yesterday, and basically you lose your game at Tetris. But the nice thing, and again, just taking it back a little bit, but the nice thing about managing my team's capacity effectively is that I'm able to push back on these demands, and I'm able to push back with a reason as well. And especially if I've got the data behind it, essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying I can't do more work. You need to make a priority call, or you need to reschedule that work, or even potentially open up that conversation around hiring additional people. But the fact that you've managed, or the fact that you are managing your team effectively, gives you the ability to be able to push back on that no, and essentially justify that no as well. Okay, so even though this was a simple example, hopefully that made sense to a lot of people. I'm hoping it did. But even though this was a simple example, I mean, sometimes the most effective processes are the simplest ones. So by focusing on some of the key principles, you can unlock a fairly significant amount of value for your organization. So if we break down the scenarios that we've just gone through, so we've seen that when resource management handled effectively, we have maximized our team. We've given our project managers the best chance of delivering value to our organization. So this dovetails back into that original point about being a value driver. So essentially what we've done is we've given the project managers the resources that they need to be able to deliver the projects that deliver value for our organization. We've also shown that gaining visibility into pipeline and capacity, we've avoided scenarios where resources are left idle or misallocated. Again, improving the productivity of the team, do more with less. By having visibility of our pipeline, we're able to spread that work evenly across the team. So this prevents that overburdening of team members, reduces stress, makes sure that the team stays motivated. And then the last point is we've facilitated some of those data-driven decisions. So having clear visibility into resource workloads allows us to make those smarter data-driven decisions. It means that we can confidently allocate resources using the information to prioritize projects, and potentially work with project managers to adjust plans. It also, and again, going back to that original point, it also gives us the data to be able to say no. So hopefully using that, really, really simple example, we've proven that a simple but structured approach to resource management can lead to huge organizational benefits. Okay, so let's go through the fundamentals. So what are the elements that make up a good resource management process? So ownership and responsibility. So, at the core, I suppose, of any effective resource management process, or resource management and capacity planning process, is a clear understanding of who does what when. I'm still amazed a little bit at organizations that we go into, and there is still not a clear understanding of who is allocating work to resources, which puts, the actual workers, the team members, in a very, very awkward situation, in the sense that they're being pulled from pillar to post with people saying, I need you to do this, I need you to do that, I need you to do this. So one of the key areas, one of the cornerstones of good resource management, is it's very important to identify who owns the resource within your organization and what role they play in that process. And to be brutally honest, it's the same with any enterprise process. Without clear ownership, accountability becomes messy, it becomes blurred, which from a resource management perspective leads to delays in decision making and at worst conflict between people, especially when you're arguing over who does work or whose work is more important. Now, one of the things that we do find when we're sort of investigating, especially in the early stages of rolling out resource management, is that there are already people in the organization that do some level of resource management. So whether they're called resource managers, whether they're called line managers, department heads, or whether they've even got a specialized group that are already looking at resource management like an RMO. So, Jacob, you talked earlier about the way that we do resourcing, and we use booking managers for our resource management process. So for all intents and purposes, a booking manager in Rego is a resource manager, and their job is really to align the right resources to the right client projects so the client is getting the most value for their money.
Yeah, and leading us into the next few slides here, understanding capacity and supply versus demand. Who owns?
And that's the last time I give you prior visibility of these slides.
Is who owns supply and who owns demand, and giving those accountabilities, setting them up clear. That's where you got to start, right, Peter?
Absolutely. Yeah, I could say, and segueing me nicely then into my next slide, understanding capacity. So it is hugely important to understand the capacity of your team to be able to deliver projects. So you would think that understanding capacity is easy, but there are a number of elements that feed into how much time your team has to be able to deliver projects. It's not just about the number of hours that they have within a day, because you've got part-time workers, so calendars, for example. You might have people on annual leave, you might have people on long-term sick. So they also need to be factored into that capacity planning process. And then you've got BAU. So this is an area that always gets overlooked when it comes to capacity planning. So I suppose it's essential to remember that your team's capacity isn't always devoted 100% to project work. So you might have people in your team that straddle both the sort of the change and the operational teams. And when there's operational tasks, they're going to take away from your ability to be able to deliver change or project work. And then the other layer on top is roles and skills. So often you can't just assign anybody to a project. So it is also important to understand or match the right people with the right skill sets to the right tasks. So ultimately, understanding capacity is easy. So everybody's got a number of hours that they work each day, but it can get a little bit more difficult to master because of the different layers of complexity. So one of the other fundamental cornerstones of effective resource management is understanding demand. So demand really comes from two key areas. So in-flight projects and then your pipeline. And both areas have their challenges, I think is the nicest way of putting it. So if we start with in-flight demand, so what do I mean by in-flight demand? So this essentially refers to the resource management or the resource requirements generated by projects that are currently ongoing or active. So it's essentially current demand. So what is the current demand for the resource pool? So managing in-flight demand is making sure that the projects have the right resources allocated to them to continue running smoothly. But the big challenge with in-flight demand is that it's heavily dependent on having good project management practices. And if anybody on this call is already doing resource management, you know that plans flex. Demand from in-flight project flexes, and keeping on top of that ever-changing resource management demand, or the resource requirement, is a bit like playing Tetris blindfolded. It's a bit like playing Tetris, actually, when the blocks change shape. So it is quite a difficult thing to do, but there are tools and techniques, and I'm sure Jacob will go through them later in the presentation to address the management of in-flight demand. Next up, we've got pipeline demand. So this is all about looking ahead, so understanding the resource requirements for future projects. And again, sounds relatively simple, but the challenge with pipeline demand is actually the quality of estimates. In fact, the granularity of estimates as well. So these are quite often at a very, very high level. I mean, if anybody's looked at a business case, generally you don't have named resources or skills in a business case. It's a little bit more generic. And in a lot of instances, it makes it very difficult for us as a resource manager to be able to accurately forecast demand on my team or on your team of resources. So managing estimates over time or managing evolving estimates over time is something that a resource manager needs to be fully aware of. So managing demand means essentially both managing your current needs and your future requirements. And we've gone through a couple of the challenges of managing both in-flight and pipeline demand. And then, now that we've explored capacity and demand, the next step is really to address those gaps. And this is basically what a resource manager will do on a daily or on a weekly basis. So I'm going to go back to my 3 questions, and you might have, if you're already a resource manager, you might have a different set of questions, but these are essentially the questions I'll ask myself over and over again. So can I take on additional workload? So really this question helps us assess whether or not we have the capacity to be able to handle new projects. So if the answer to that is yes, can I balance available resources to satisfy demand? So how do we spread the team optimally to allocate our resources without overwhelming the team? And then does anything need to change? And then perhaps this is the most critical question out of the 3. So is there a smarter way to allocate my team? Should we consider working with the PM to shift timelines, working with demand or portfolio managers to make a priority call, or potentially working with HR to hire in additional help? So from a resource manager's perspective, addressing those gaps means that we're taking a proactive approach to identifying whether or not your current capacity aligns with your project demand. So next up, best practices. So I'm going to hand this section over to my friend Jacob. All yours, Jacob.
Awesome. So let's talk about what you can do with either getting started or moving things forward where you're at. We'll kind of cover both of those perspectives. So next slide, Peter. Resource management is not something you can just buy and turn on. This is like an organization's culture and organic sort of growth skill set and set of practices. So we always use at Rego the crawl, walk, run type of metaphor here, because starting out with the basics and not overshooting what your organization can handle from a change management perspective is really important. And you want to be able to get a little bit of value in each step along the way, grow sustainably. And then in some cases, you might not take resource management as far as other organizations based on the type of work you do, based on how long your projects are, or how, frequent you change assignments. If you, in your organization, if you leave people, let's say you make medical devices and they're 3-year-long projects, and you leave 100 people on a project for 3 years. Well, your resource management needs are probably, they're a little bit lower volume than if you are a tech company that puts out a release every 3 to 6 months, as an example.
Or
so
professional services company.
Or us. Yeah, we'll have people full time. Yeah, we'll have people full time, right, Peter? And we'll have people for 2 weeks working on something.
Yep, or 2 hours in some instances.
Yeah. So there's really a few categories here. So reactive is where we end up meeting a lot of organizations. So as Peter was mentioning earlier, the blocks are stacking up. Okay, everyone work on this. Okay, let's go over here and do that. And it's like this intense, fast moving, let's jump on it, play whack-a-mole with our staffing challenges. And it's kind of fun. Like I've been in an organization, and in my 20s, I thoroughly enjoyed that energy and that fun. Just go to work and go crazy for 8 to 10 hours. But it's not sustainable, and it's not good for our home work-life balance. It's not good for our quality of work and our delivery. It's not good for our predictability on our schedules. So we want to start to become more proactive. We want to be able to forecast out 3 to 6 months. So you might not forecast an entire project. You might just forecast the next 2 phases, as an example. That's a great win for a lot of organizations. And then we staff and look for gaps and learn when, like Peter was saying, to say no. Everyone's fully allocated. We're out of people. We can no longer work on the rest of these projects. That's tough. It's tough to get there. Feels great when you do. It doesn't have to be tough to get there. So we have some methodologies and strategies we'll share with you. And then when you fully mature and you're highly effective, well, that's great. Now we predict out probably a year to 18 months. We talk about team health. We leave people in more sustainable teams. We understand the consultative type roles in our organization that move around a lot, and we compensate for that. And I would say, and Peter can back me up here, mature organizations as well are highly partnered with their HR department. So whoever plans work, whether it's a PMO or not, is connected to when they need more people, and they partner with HR, and they can queue up requisitions or bring in consulting firms through procurement. And so, that mature organization has multiple levers they can pull to staff their work.
Absolutely. Yeah, highly integrated, full stop. I think there is finance teams integration, obviously integration with your enterprise processes. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Having a direct line into HR and HR actually using the data that you're managing from a capacity planning perspective as well is an indicator that you are at that mature level, proactive mature level.
Right on. So how do we make sure we're starting out simple, but providing some value? So there's a few areas we have to look at. Number one is granularity. Do I need to know what Peter's doing on Wednesday morning of next week? I do not. However, Peter's fulfilling a role working for a specific client for the next 2 months. It's comfortable to me. Peter's dedicated to achieve that work. Do I know specifically what he's assigned to? I don't really need that for the resource management analysis and practices. So how do I build a dedication model? And sometimes you'll hear this called allocations. How do I allocate resources with enough information so I can determine where I run out of resources? It makes sense to think you should do that bottoms up. So if you take building a home as an example, and you're going to need carpenters, concrete foundation here in Canada, you need electricians, plumbers, and so on, HVAC and all those other things. You know the resources you need, but do I specifically need to know the day that they're showing up to do so? It sounds like you should reasonably be able to do that. One project at a time, that is kind of reasonable. Across an enterprise of projects, the juice is not worth the squeeze. When you're trying to figure out how to staff 100 people, 200 people, 500 people, those details, any little change in detail, the whole model ripples. So we want to more talk about the average dedication model across those 100, 200, 500 people. That's the comfort zone for resource management. And then at
this one, sorry, Jacob, cut across, but granularity is probably the one area that we see people fail on the most. So they try and go from zero or relatively immature resource management and capacity planning processes to superheroes in the space of a few weeks or months. And they very, very quickly find out that the overhead of managing resource management information at such a low granularity date. So in other words, like 2 hours on a Thursday, bills aligned to this project. The overhead of managing that outweighs the benefit of resource management and capacity planning. And it is, we have so many organizations that go too deep too quickly.
Clever people, it seems logical, it's just not practical. So Peter, I, pretty much everyone at Rego, we've learned that lesson through time. That's one of the scars Peter mentioned. And so we can provide you that guidance and advice now, doing this hundreds of times with different organizations. Next is process. So again, I would say, and for sure in Canada, we are great at designing process, but we're even better at working around it somehow, like finding ways to like work past and around the process. So let's not do that. Let's make a very simple process. Peter and I are going to walk you through one in a little bit here, and let's make sure it's makes sense, it's valuable, and it's simple. Project manager estimates needs. Maybe they get domain experts to help them, right? They might be new, they might not know how to estimate yet, so they go ask experts on the scope. Resource manager staffs to it. Keep a simple cycle, right? And then next, accountability goes with process. So we go to organizations where a project manager is an admin. They just record resource management data, okay? And the resource manager owns estimating and staffing. Okay, that's fine. As long as that's what you're going for, that is clearly communicated and those are the roles. That's not my favorite setup, but I have seen it work. So, let's make sure we call out who's accountable for what and be clear about it. So effective process, we get simple data models to back that up. Now, when it comes to process, and Peter and you'll see this in our messaging all over the place in different Rego messaging, it's still about the people. So like the process has to have a light data model that enables discussions. There's a lot about resource management you would never put in a software system or on a spreadsheet. So maybe Peter has a client that's close to him in London, and they don't want to work with someone from North America. Well, we're not going to put that in our staffing request. Probably Peter's going to say, yeah, I think we should staff this person over here, Steve, because he's local and it's going to create less friction of bringing someone in from overseas. And so but there could be a lot more sensitive information about that could be related to culture and accents or personality conflicts. You just wouldn't track them in software, but to staff using those considerations. So we have to consider the process and really lean on people and keep the tools and the data model really simple. So the data needs to be a baseline that you can jump off of. We need to have somewhere to record our discussions, and we have to have it clear, automated, transparent, accessible. So you can start in an Excel model, and very quickly, it's all about broken links and connecting things. And you can buy very practical tools that build this for you. Project manager asks for roles and people. Resource manager supplies them, and you look at the dashboards in this case of where someone's overloaded, underloaded, and you can understand your staffing health real time. That is the goal. So those of you who said you're in the middle of the pack for maturity, if you don't have a tool with some automation for this today, it's time. And Peter, with cloud offerings, this stuff is pennies on the dollar than it was 5-7 years ago.
It just makes sense nowadays. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think the cost of the platform is the tiny cost when it comes to rolling out resource management. I think, the people costs, the cost of running the process is significantly higher than the tooling itself.
Right on. Now, next up here, you have to keep the communication lines going. So we have to be able to ensure that we have a healthy relationship between project managers, resource managers, and the team with both. When a team member has a challenge or an issue, or they feel that they've been assigned too much work, they need to be able to communicate that both ways. A project manager has to be able to work closely with a resource manager for many things, to learn how to staff better, to learn how to estimate. They have to be able to have blunt conversations when something's not working out. So, in our business, we don't have a choice. We get blunt feedback. Something's going wrong. Can we have a new person? All those things. That's the nature of professional services. But when we're inside a company and we're working with all employees, sometimes that's sensitive. And building these strong relationships between a supply and demand type management role is so important, so they can have those blunt conversations. So a simple process example, and really, in a lot of ways, you don't need to deviate from this too much. And this could work in Agile and Waterfall as well. When you think of Agile staffing, it can be more team-based. Maybe you're not calling out by the person themselves. You're making it more of a, I need this team, I need that team. But so as we bring in the project, we assign our leadership to the project, and they can go start to understand the scope, and then start to estimate what the project would take. What roles do they need? How long would they need to work on the project, and so on. Resource managers then work closely with them to say, okay, I see what you're asking for. I think you need more of this, this, and this, and here's who I think is a fit. And then once that team is built, they continue to have healthy discussions and refine estimates to keep that project healthy. It can be as simple as that.
And the nice thing, just to interject very quickly, the nice thing about this it is a very simple staffing process example. It touches on all three of those major areas that we talked about earlier. So demand management, project management, resource management, and capacity planning. So if you think about this process, project intake, all the way through to project management, defining roles, resource managers, looking at roles to understand capacity and who can work on that particular project, and then project managers and resource managers working in tandem throughout the course of that project, delivering that project and the resources needed to deliver the project. So yeah, very, very simple process example, but it actually covers all of those major components that make up a good resource management process.
Right on. And I'll go quickly through these next couple because I know we got 8 minutes left. Put my foot on the gas here. So OCM, so important, right? We're dealing with key communications aspects here, different people, different roles, different personas. So we want to make sure we articulate what's in it for each person. What's in it for the PM, the team member, the RM. We have to understand the why really well. What we're doing, what is the data we're going to document, how are we going to record it, how often we're going to meet. We have to understand the specific actions, the what, and then how do we roll this out? How do we train? Is an important consideration. Coaching, ongoing mentoring, structure of workshops we recommend that you do indefinitely, like a monthly over allocations review or weekly drop-in sessions for exceptions, like when we have upcoming staffing requests. That's what we do at our organization. So there's practices you can follow to make this successful that we see many, many times.
So all good. So thanks, Jacob. I mean, I'll go through the other considerations really, really quickly. So we've talked about the fundamental components that make up a capacity planning and resource management process. Jacob's gone through some of those best practices. If there's one best practice I can highlight over and over again, it's start simple. Try and start simple with your resource management processes and then evolve over time. But one of the things that we do see quite a lot is the centralization of a resource management function using an RMO or a center of excellence, depending on the, what you classify things within your organization. And this is a really, really good way of being able to give a bit of gravitas to resource management within your organization. So essentially what you do is you take the ownership of the tools, the process, roles and responsibility, and also that continuous improvement roadmap, and you centralize all of that within a group or a person, depending on the size of your organization, and then call them essentially an RMO. The other area really to think about is your delivery methodology. So we've talked a lot throughout the course of this presentation around how you're aligning and allocating staff to projects. But if your organization is a little bit more edging towards agile, you might want to have a think about how that is going to affect your resource management processes, because really essentially what you're doing is you're resourcing a team, and then that team is working on a backlog. So the key point of this slide, I suppose, is to make sure that you're selecting the right process for the methodology, the delivery methodology that's currently in existence within your organization. Okay, next steps. So we've explored best practices. So let's talk about where we can go next. And this is quite heavily dependent on where you are in that journey. But if you haven't started, start yesterday. But remember, it's really important, and I'll pull it out again, start simple. Start simple and allow the process to grow over a period of time. Don't forget about that integration with your other enterprise processes. Resource management can't work on its own, or it's very difficult to work on its own without that integration point between demand management and project management or product management. Leverage data. So whether you're using Excel, whether you're using Clarity by Rego, whether you're using another solution, try and leverage the data and make sure that you let everybody know that you're using data. Because if you're using data and everybody knows about it, you'll be amazed at how quickly the quality of the data improves. And then find a good fit. You might not need a heavyweight process. You might not be a professional services organization that needs to track the number of hours being worked on a project or the availability of a person on an hourly basis. You might have, a much better organizer. You might get much more organizational value from a much more simpler process. And also consider that delivery methodology as well. So if you're using more of an agile-based approach to delivering change within your organization, think about using teams. If you're more of a traditional projects and programs, think about that project and resourcing process. And every webinar's got to have a call to action. If you want to bypass some of the pain, come and talk to us. So hopefully you've seen today how critical effective resource management processes are. But becoming truly mature in your approach does take time, tools, the right mindset, the right process. This is all stuff that we're able to help you with. So Clarity by Rego, and again, you can download the slides, but Clarity by Rego offers a streamlined, powerful solution that scales with your organizational needs. So whether you're just starting out, so whether you're at that low end of the maturity or whether you're looking to mature your processes, there is a ton of functionality and process and consulting skills that we can give you to help you accelerate that quickly. So James, I'm going to hand it over. We were going to try and finish early, but I think we talked a little bit longer than we were expecting. I don't know if there was any questions, James?
There are some questions I want to say to the audience. I know we're a bit short on time. We will reach out to answer those questions, so please wait for that. And thank you so much to everyone for attending today. And Pete, Jacob, great presentation. Thank you.